Welcome, one and all, to the second episode of Pragyan Talks. Today, we have with us Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao, who is an economist and a retired IS officer. He served as the governor of the RBI from 2008 to 2013. Prior to that, Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao was the finance secretary to the Government of India. He was also the secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Currently, he is a distinguished visiting faculty at the National University of Singapore. Can you proceed with the interview, sir?
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. The first question which I would like to ask you is, how grave do you think this crisis is for our economy?
The situation is actually quite grim for the world and indeed for India. Most analysts are agreed that the growth rate this year for India will be negative, that the economy will actually contract for the first time in 40 years. The estimates of how negative the growth will vary from about -2% to -12%, even if we take the median of that, about -4%. So last year we were growing at +4%, perhaps a little lower. This year we'll be growing at -4%, perhaps a little lower. That means an adjustment in our growth rate of at least 8 percentage points in just 1 year. That's a very sharp adjustment to make in 1 year. It can be very painful, very disruptive, very difficult, even for a rich country. In a country like ours, it can inflict enormous pain and hardship on millions of poor households, on millions of micro and small enterprises. It can threaten our financial stability. Even before the crisis hit us, the virus COVID-19 crisis hit us, our economy was in quite a bad situation. Let's throw our mind back to January this year, before the crisis hit us. What were we worried about? We were worried about our growth. Our growth, which was 8% 4 years ago, 7% 3 years ago, 6% 2 years ago, 4% last year, is going to be -4% this year. Our growth, which is slowing, has completely stalled. We were worried about our fiscal deficit, about how much our central and state governments were borrowing. By the time this crisis is behind us, we'll worry even more about that. We were worried about the health of our financial sector, the health of our banks, the health of our non-bank finance companies, the level of non-performing assets, the trust deficit in some of our private sector banks. All of those concerns are going to deepen, and the stress on our financial sector will deepen as we come out of this crisis. Now, another thing that I want to say about how grim the situation is, lives versus livelihoods has been a common issue or common term in public policy discourse during this crisis. Every government battling the corona crisis is confronting this dilemma. But the dilemma is arguably the sharpest for India, is lives versus livelihoods. Because of our weak medical infrastructure and our high population density, any let-up in prevention can mean loss of millions of lives. On the other hand, if we impose a very strict lockdown to control the pandemic, it can mean millions losing livelihoods. So the government has had to struggle with this dilemma of lives versus livelihoods in a very uncertain situation at a time when growth is actually rapidly decelerating. So that's how grim the current situation is.
Moving on, the stimulus package announced by the government aims towards helping MSMEs and other businesses. How effective is the package at helping its purpose? Could the government have spent more? What will be the consequences of exceeding the spending, sir?
That's a very big question, but let me try and summarize my answer as succinctly as possible. The Atmanirbhar package announced by the government of 20 trillion rupees, which is 10% of GDP, aroused a lot of expectations and hope. But when we heard all of it from the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister over 5 days, the impression I got was that it was very amorphous. It was a combination of a stimulus package, a self-reliance package, or a reform package. But there was no framework given around it. when I tried to look through and understand all of it, the big picture I got was that the government actually put three things into it. The first is a survival package, that is to help people and businesses cope with the lockdown when the economy was shut down by way of transfer payments to poor households, by way of guarantees to small and medium enterprises. Then there was a second element in that, which was a stimulus package to help the economy revive once the lockdown is lifted, which is what we're going through now. And the third package, which is a reform package, is to help the economy reach a medium-term reasonable growth trajectory from where we left off. So when we strip the packaging, the Atmanirbhar package actually contained very little of government spending, about 1% of GDP. In my view, that is okay because the government is very fiscally constrained. If we look at the fiscal numbers, we will see that the fiscal deficit is already going to be very heavy, very high. The budgeted fiscal deficit of the central and state governments for this year, this fiscal year, was 6.5% of GDP. Just the loss of revenue on account of the lockdown will take that ratio to about 10% of GDP. The additional borrowing on account of the stimulus package and the relief to poor households and small enterprises is going to take that fiscal deficit to about 12 to 13% of GDP. That's quite high. And there is a risk that we will suffer all the negative impact of fiscal deficits that we did in the past. What are the negative impacts of fiscal deficit? It can put pressure on our inflation. It can put pressure on our balance of payments. It can crowd out private investment. And together, all these things can impact our growth prospects in the medium term. So the government is caught in a fiscal dilemma. The government is caught in a fiscal dilemma between spending now and preserving our medium-term growth prospects, or preserving our medium-term growth prospects and spend less now. So it's a big dilemma for the government. There are some people who say that this is an extraordinary crisis. The government should not be looking at the fiscal numbers, should spend as much as is necessary, should borrow as much as is necessary for that purpose. I believe that the government should spend more. The government should borrow more in order to finance that spending. That is a political imperative. That is a moral imperative. But I also believe that the government should set itself a limit up front in order to retain market confidence. And retaining market confidence is a very, very important factor when we're fighting a crisis, because if the market loses confidence in the Indian economy, the negative impact can be much higher than what we're trying to avoid by spending more today. So as much as I believe we should be borrowing and spending more, we should be quite upfront about it, set a limit, go about it with caution, prudently, so that the government spends efficiently.
What will be the consequences of exceeding the spending, sir? The next question. The Prime Minister has outlined a 4L strategy that involves addressing the structural bottlenecks in the areas of land, labor, liquidity, and laws. What reforms are needed to realize this?
Well, the Prime Minister's 4L program in itself, the reform package. In land, we know that investors, entrepreneurs find it very difficult to get land. On the other hand, the government wants to ensure that farmers who are parting with their land get a fair compensation. Not only the current value of that land, but the prospective value of the land. So the government has the obligation to balance the interests of the farmers who are selling the land and the interests of investors who are buying the land. And we need a land law that balances the interest of the investors and the farmers. And labor, again, the problems and the necessary reforms are all well known, which is that there are a lot of rigidities in the labor market. Unless those rigidities are diluted or removed, investment cannot take place. Same thing with liquidity. I believe what the Prime Minister meant by liquidity is to ensure that there is credit flow from formal financial institutions, both banks and non-banks, to the most needy, especially small and medium enterprises who do not get enough credit, especially to farmers who do not get enough credit. So I believe that's what the Prime Minister meant by liquidity. And finally, there is the loss. Loss does not mean legislating more laws. I believe what the Prime Minister meant, I hope what he meant was that we have laws on our statute books. What we must make sure is that those laws are implemented in the right spirit to the best benefit of our economy, so that investment takes place and jobs are generated and growth is generated. And what we need for that is reforms. Of course, the reform package has been talked about, and I don't have the time or the occasion to talk about that reform package in detail. But the only thing I want to say is that as much as structural reforms encompassing these 4 L's are important, governance reforms are equally important. What I mean by governance reforms is that we have good policies in Delhi or in our state capitals, but we need to implement those policies efficiently, effectively at the front end, which is the cutting edge, where people, ordinary people, entrepreneurs, investors, they all interact with the government. So we need governance reforms to make sure that the entire government machinery is accountable for the implementation of reforms and to make sure that the benefits
What
of these
reforms are needed to
flow
realize this? The next question is, what do you think will be the role of central institutions, specifically the RBI, in mitigating the after effects of COVID-19? How can the RBI and the center come up with a collective response to tackle this crisis?
Well, we've seen that the Reserve Bank of India has been quite active for the last 3-4 months in order to manage this crisis, as indeed the government has been, which is what's happening across every country. Governments and central banks are acting together, and that's the case in our country as well, that the government and the Reserve Bank of India are acting together. But what we must understand in managing this crisis is that this crisis we're going through today on account of the coronavirus is quite different from the previous crisis that people compare it to, which is the global financial crisis of 2008-9. It is true that we are seeing the governments and central banks do the same things that they did in 2008. For example, governments are coming out with fiscal packages, central banks are easing monetary policy and coming up with unconventional monetary policies. But nevertheless, there are important differences between 2008 and today's crisis. In 2008, global financial crisis originated in the financial sector because of excesses, because of excessive risk-taking, reckless risk-taking in the financial sector. The solution had to come from the financial sector, and therefore central banks were in the forefront of infusing confidence in financial markets. The corona crisis we are going through today, on the other hand, is a crisis from outside the financial and economic system, and the solution has to come from science. So what the governments and central banks are doing by way of fiscal packages and monetary packages is a holding operation. Till a vaccine is found or till the pandemic is under control. We need to understand that. So the Reserve Bank has done quite a lot of things, both conventional monetary policy by way of cutting rates, injecting enormous amount of liquidity into the system, as well as unconventional policies like targeted LTROs, special schemes for non-bank finance companies, for mutual funds, for housing finance companies, etc. So I believe the Reserve Bank has been quite active, and the Reserve Bank and the government are working together to manage this crisis, as indeed central banks and governments are doing in every other country.
Thank you, sir. Moving on, the coronavirus situation has illuminated the plight of the underprivileged and daily wage laborers. How can we strengthen the safety net significantly for the most vulnerable?
Thank you, Sudarshan. That's a very important question. When this crisis is behind us, I hope that is soon enough. The most enduring image of this crisis will be millions of these informal sector workers reverse migrating from urban areas to their villages, with families, with children, with their belongings, walking in hot sun, braving thirst and hunger, and even braving the resistance from authorities across state borders. So the entire country is now sensitive to the plight of informal sector workers. Indeed, we are sensitive and conscious of how much these informal sector workers from villages across the country are contributing to our economy. So the estimate is that there are about 40 million of them. I believe that's an underestimate. Perhaps there are many more. You're right that as much as they have come, they have migrated from villages to urban areas in search of better livelihood, in search of higher incomes. There is an obligation on the state to ensure that they're protected, that they get reasonable wages, that they get reasonable housing, that they live in reasonably healthy conditions, that they do not live in squalor, and that they have some safety nets by way of medical attention, by way of education for their children, etc. Providing safety nets is a big challenge in every country, especially in a poor country struggling for resources like India. Our governments, both at the center in Delhi and states, give out a lot of subsidies, which are in the nature of providing safety nets to the poor and vulnerable groups. The criticism against those subsidies is that they're not targeted. There is a lot of leakage. There should be a more comprehensive review, and that they should be better targeted so as to attack poverty. One suggestion people make is universal basic income. That is a good idea in theory. I don't know to what extent it will work in practice, because universal basic income as a safety net, given our fiscal situation, will work only if it comes in lieu of all other subsidies. So the central and state governments have to enter into a social compact with the people, saying that we're eliminating all other subsidies, and in lieu of that, we are giving you a universal basic income. Of course, we should not give it to all 1.3 billion people. We should knock out the top 25%. So we should give it to 1 billion people in the country. And even if we give 1,000 rupees per person per month, that's going to be about 5 to 6%. So we have to plan that carefully, but you're very right that we need to review the basic framework of our social safety nets.
Moving on, sir. How long will the recession take to roll back? What long-lasting effect on consumer confidence will it have? What can be done to bolster it in the post-pandemic world to aid economic growth?
It's difficult to make a forecast on how quickly recovery will come, how quickly this crisis will be behind us. Most recessions caused by financial sector problems or financial sector excessive risk or bubbles result in a V-shaped recovery. A V-shaped recovery, as is intuitively understandable, is a sharp decline in growth followed by a sharp recovery. Over the last 30, 40 years, every recession caused by financial sector problems has resulted in a V-shaped recovery, except the global financial crisis, which has, in advanced economies, resulted in a U-shaped recovery. This recession, the expectations were that back in March, April, and even last month in May, were that this recession also might result in a V-shaped recovery, because our infrastructure is still in place, our factories are still standing, our transport systems are intact. So if the corona crisis, if the pandemic is behind us, we can trigger, engineer a revival of the economy pretty soon. But the possibility and the probability of a V-shaped recovery is receding day by day. And we also don't know if the virus will come back in waves, as some epidemiologists are predicting. If that happens, we could in fact have a W-shaped recovery. So it's difficult at this point of time to hazard even an approximate forecast on when a recovery, how long this crisis or this recession will take to recover. As far as consumer confidence is concerned, it is true that consumer confidence is shattered now, both out of fear and because of loss of incomes. Especially in poor countries like India, people have lost their savings, they've spent all their savings. So unless their incomes come back on, they will not be able to spend. Besides that, a new variable now is the uncertainty, the fear about the pandemic. So I believe consumer confidence will pick up soon if there is a vaccine for the pandemic, and if governments around the world, including in India, implement policies to stimulate growth, which is to put money in the hands of poor people, which they spend, and ensure that credit flows to productive activities so that there is supply to meet the growing demand.
Sir, what are the big public policy lessons of this crisis? Should the budget allocate more funds from future editions for developing a robust healthcare infrastructure and invest more in healthcare R&D?
Thank you. That's a very wise question, because every crisis is a learning opportunity. And wise people learn from their crisis. So should all of us in the country, ordinary people too, and especially our governments and public institutions. The crisis has thrown up several public policy lessons. The first is about spending resources and effort and mind space on expanding and improving our preventive health care. We know that pandemics are going to be more frequent in the future. And in order to minimize the impact on people, especially poor and vulnerable sections of the society, it's very important that we spend more on preventive health so that they're in better health. As we are now being told, they're best preventive against coronavirus and indeed against every possible infectious disease is to be in good health. In advanced countries, in rich societies, they can spend more on curative care because their preventive care is taken care of. But in a country like India, I think we should be spending more on preventive care. I believe that's the first public policy lesson in this crisis. The second, I would say, is the use of technology. All of you being engineering students, being in the thick of technology, you're all aware of how big data can be used to analyze the problems and quickly to respond to arising problems. For example, yes, millions of informal sector workers, migrants have started going back home, walking to villages. Even if we grant that the government did not plan enough for the return, but once they started moving, to what extent have we used big data to track their movement, to ensure that their safety and their health is protected as they move back to their villages, how to ensure that transport is provided to them. So deployment of big data to manage some of our big challenges will be the next public policy lesson I can see. The third public policy lesson that this crisis throws up especially is the importance of coordination between central governments, state governments, and local governments, especially in a large country like India with 1.3 billion people and 29 states and 7 union territories. Managing crises like this requires coordination between the central governments and local governments in order to make sure that the central government marshals the experience from across the country and gives the big picture, gives the big guidelines, but leaves enough flexibility to the state governments and to the local governments to manage the situation at the front end. So that's the other lesson thrown up by the crisis. And those are some of the things that I can think of right at this moment.
Thank you very much, sir. We are very glad that you are able to join us today. The final question I would like to ask you is, what message do you have for India's youth?
It would be presumptuous on my part to give a message to young people. I believe the youth of this country are the promise of this country. This country offers you enormous opportunities. You have opportunities to learn not only from resources available within the country, resources available within the world. I would say, if you pressure me to give a message, I would say this is the time to learn, keep your mind open, question everything, draw your own lessons, listen, keep an open mind, listen to all opinions, study a lot, read a lot, maintain a breadth of interests so that you become useful and relevant citizens of India.
Thank you very much, sir, for today's interview.
All of you, thank you very much. You're all wonderful people.